Welcome to SmithWeekly Discussions, an occasional program for our members of SmithWeekly Research. Please note this program is a private discussion and everything contained herein is for entertainment and educational purposes only. With that, we hope you're in a comfortable position along with your favorite beverage to enjoy the discussion. We remind our audience to examine our show notes attached to each of our shows to better understand how our program functions. Before we get into our discussion, we want to say thanks for questions coming from the audience at SmithWeekly, including Craig S., Mark R., Jackie A., Mike P., Brian H., and Scott S. On the podcast today is a returning guest and one that we're pleased to have join us. Mr. Brandon Munro is back on the program. Brandon is the executive chairman of Bannerman Energy. The company is focused on the development of the Etango uranium project in Namibia, West Africa, of which is nearing the final investment decision phase and is in a class of nearer term new build conventional uranium projects that is expected to be online in the coming years. Of course, within a proven uranium producing jurisdiction in Namibia. Bannerman Energy is listed on the Australian Securities Exchange under the symbol BMN, as well as on the US OTC markets under the symbol BNNLF. Mr. Munro, thank you for coming back on the podcast. Welcome.
Thanks, Andrew. It's really great to be back chatting.
Yeah, Brandon, it's a pleasure to have you back on. And yeah, well over a year since we last spoke on a podcast. So great to have you back to update our audience. Of course, we have some new audience. I'm sure some have come and gone, of course. But why don't we start off here, Brandon? You know, one of the things that besides Bannerman, of course, the second best thing I like to listen to is your take on the market because you're so well tuned into it and you have such a great perspective that we have to ask you to start off here with your take on the current market status and maybe just some of the key items that are on your mind here as we go through well over half of 2024.
Yeah, look, what a journey it's been, Andrew. I think the first time that we spoke on a podcast was probably 2017 and communicated every year or so since then. And it's been an incredible revival for nuclear power. We knew back then that it would be a supply story, and it was a case of waiting and positioning for the excess inventory to drain out of this sector. Now we've seen that happen, and now we've seen a tremendous positive demand signal start to build up. So this is no longer simply a supply story waiting for previous imbalances to resolve so that the current imbalance, which favors investors, to become more prominent. We've got that dynamic, there's no doubt about that, but we've now got an urgency that we haven't seen in this sector quite literally since the 70s. So maybe if I break all of those down a little bit, particularly for new investors and for people who perhaps haven't had the long opportunity as you and I have to study this sector. We had a sector which was more or less in balance until the events of the Great Tohoku earthquake in Japan in 2011 led to a tsunami, led to an accident at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station. And despite the impacts of that being very contained, particularly in the context of the enormous tragedies associated with the tsunami and other energy sources within Japan, there was a media, political, and NGO reaction that affected the entire world. And within short months, we saw 10% of the world's nuclear power demand eliminated. And that was through reactor pauses in Japan and closures in Germany and elsewhere. This is a sector that traditionally operates in a very balanced way. Now, in principle, the demand and the supply in nuclear power is very balanced if you compare it to other commodities. And I say in principle because timing does have a big impact, and I'm sure that timing is frustrating many investors and other market participants out there. But in principle, we know where all of the demand for nuclear power and uranium is, because uranium is only mined for nuclear power, and uranium is the only and unsubstitutable fuel source for nuclear power as we stand today. So what that means is all of the reactors in the world, we know where they are, we can calculate with a high degree of precision how much nuclear fuel and therefore how much uranium they consume. And we know with pretty good lead time how much uranium they're going to be consuming, at least over the next 5 years. Now, equally, we know because of tight IAEA controls and all of the multilateral and treaty protections that exist as a web around the world, we know where all of the uranium is being mined in the world and where it's being created as byproducts. And so we know what the primary supply is with a pretty good degree of precision. And because, like nuclear power plants, the lead times of bringing on a mine are just so long in this sector, we can make some pretty good estimations about how soon new supply is going to come on. So that's why I say in principle, compared to copper or lithium or other commodities where there are some huge swings in terms of demand expectations, in principle, over a few years, we can marry them up pretty carefully and pretty clearly. What we had after Fukushima was a big change in demand. 10% of the world's demand evaporated and took almost a decade to recover, but at the same time, no change in supply. And that was because most of the supply was being delivered under long-term contracts, which continued on foot. That meant that between 2011 and really 2018, 2019, the world was accumulating and producing more uranium than it needed. It took some time for that excess inventory to wash out of the sector, helped in no small part by the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust and Yellowcake, listed on the LSE, absorbing excess pounds from August 2021. Where we find ourselves today is a uranium market which has normalized its levels of inventory to a point where there is no longer any inventory overhang, a supply picture which we have with a high degree of precision, a demand picture which we have at least as a consumption line item, what's consumed in the nuclear power industry with a high degree of precision, and a big deficit between the two. So in rough terms, the mined uranium around the world, when added to what we call secondary supply, trails what is consumed in the sector by 30 to 35 million pounds per annum, which is a big proportion when we consider that the consumption in the sector is roughly 180 to 185 million pounds. Now that's a huge deficit. Why is that not having a bigger impact on price? Well, that's where we need to draw a distinction between what's consumed in the sector and what's actually bought in the sector. Because the consumption continues on, nuclear power plants continue working, they continue consuming uranium. New builds are proceeding at pace at the moment. There's a concept in this sector called first loads, where when a nuclear power plant is first turned on, you need about 3.5 years worth of power to load up that reactor. So there's a bulge effect whenever a nuclear power plant is built around the world. Now that's not the same as what utilities are actually buying. And after a long period of time of utilities overstocking, as I say, they were still committed to long-term contracts, even though globally they didn't need all of that uranium. Utilities then allowed those long-term contracts to expire and went into a period of understocking. In other words, they're not replacing what they are consuming at a global level. And we're still in that phase. The amount of contracting and spot market purchasing by end users in this sector has still not reached what we call replacement level contracting. So for anyone who's out there who's been following the sector and looking at it carefully for some time and is frustrated that there isn't more action, well, I would put to you that it's remarkable that we are still in a trading range of the mid $80 per pound on a spot market with a long-term contract price that roughly reflects that, even though the sector is not yet expressing itself in economics for the deficit. So in other words, the deficit is not being exposed because the utilities are not buying enough uranium to restock what they're using and therefore not buying enough uranium to expose that deficit. So as an overall market for uranium, I think the key principles are it's very, very strong as evidenced by the current price. The downside upside risk remains in asymmetry. We've seen even with uranium coming under some spot market pressure in recent weeks, key players, including consumers of uranium, have been happy to step in and start mopping up pounds. So I feel like we're pretty close to a foundational base or a floor in uranium where it is now. And we've got a number of tremendous demand pressures that are building up over the next 6 months in particular. The first demand pressure is simply that utilities start to contract again and start replacement level contracting. The second, and we can come on to this if you like, is, well, what happens when it moves from replacement level contracting to, instead of destocking, they change into restocking? And then what happens when all of the key demand signals and the demand growth that's in this sector start to have an impact on this market? So I feel very, very confident and very comfortable with where we are in the sector. And I think whilst it's a little bit soggy out there at the moment and it's hard going for investors as we record this podcast, I think it's a case of hang in there, because the balance of this calendar year going into 2025 is going to be really exciting. And that's without even talking about all the supply factors that are contributing to that confidence that I've got. So I might just pause there, Andrew. That's a basic overview of where I see the sector right now.
Brandon, thank you for that. Lots of stuff there, a lot of agreement as well, how we see this going. And of course, those various catalysts here to get things moving even more so than they already are, of course, behind the scenes. I like your characterization of the sentiment out there as soggy. I appreciate that. That's a good word to utilize there. And the junior natural resource sector as a whole, not just uranium, will teach you patience. And you'll be educated very hard on patience if you're not becoming patient. And so I think anybody who's been in the sector for a period of time understands that. And so this is part of the process. It is part of multiple corrections that we've had in an overall bull market for uranium. And then, of course, yes, the frenzy that comes with respect to that replacement rate contracting, and then also some of the other catalysts that drive utilities to behave in the overstock category as they start to realize that material's hard to come by, and then also suppliers are quite unreliable, and it's difficult to find a reliable supplier, or there's just not enough suppliers that produce of size, so you have to go and you have to backstop based on jurisdiction, economics, management ability, all the other factors, and those things are going to weigh into this as well. And that hasn't happened. And then you throw in, wrenches into the spoke, Brandon, like some of the U.S. issues with respect to the waivers and Russia's supply of fuel and all of that nonsense that happens in Washington, which puts people on pause while they try to sort it out with their lobbyists and lawyers and Department of Commerce and everybody else there that's fighting it out. So also that you placed so well the earthquake and the proper sequence leading up to Fukushima. I really appreciate that, and good that you're putting it out there the right way so people also understand the causes and the effects of that event. You mentioned something there where this process is ongoing, patience is required, but do you see, Brandon, that there's a scenario where the market stays stagnant, not over in the next 6 months, but maybe over the next 1 to 2 years for potentially other factors, including broad market conditions, and then this patch through scenario where material continues to get used and utilities don't take action? Do you think that's possible, or is there something that maybe challenges how we think this plays out over the next, short term, meaning 1 to 2 years?
Look, I think as you start to push the end of that time frame that you've articulated, Andrew, the market necessarily must solve itself. So I don't think that the market can remain stagnant for a period as long as 2 years. It can be stubborn in the short term, and where I am less confident is in the broader macro picture. There's a lot of risk out there, and uranium is still a small sector. As buoyant and as positive as the demand signals are in uranium, and as fragile as supply is in uranium, this sector is too small to swim against the tide if we see a major negative macro event, or even a series of negative macro events Middle East and elsewhere that can shake investor confidence. Having said that, nuclear power plants are the last energy source to turn off. We saw that during COVID when many energy sources were turned to zero, when oil was trading at negative $40 a barrel. Nuclear power delivered 95% of the energy that it delivered the previous year. So it's an incredibly resilient energy source that's very slow to ramp down and very slow to turn off. So even in a disastrous macro scenario, something that would be truly a flock of black swans, nuclear power plants are just going to continue absorbing and consuming uranium, and nuclear power plants, fuel buyers, will continue to restock and buy uranium. Now, then you say to yourself, well, if you were to play out a super negative macro scenario, if we were really going to get our favorite beverage and start imagining what could possibly go wrong and compound a bunch of other bad things that could happen, what that's going to do to supply is it's going to create a lot of headwinds for new supply. It's probably going to make financing new mines more difficult. It's going to make producing uranium more difficult. And even in that enormously pessimistic scenario, nuclear power plants are still going to need to find uranium from somewhere. And rather ironically, it's probably going to lead to increasing prices because they won't have the same selection of suppliers to choose from. And so that's why the idea of, as long as demand continues to be what it is today, let alone much of the demand growth that we would see, I'm confident that we're reaching a long-term uranium price that's above $80 a pound. And let me contrast that for a moment with the last cycle. So many people love to compare uranium today with uranium in 2005, 2006, 2007. Now, I prefer to compare the uranium cycle that we're in now to the uranium cycle in the 70s, because I do think it's a far better comparison on fundamentals. One of the key distinctions between the short spike that we had in 2006, 2007 is when the global financial crisis led to concerns about financing new nuclear power plants, that took a lot of the heat out of the sector. So you would be right in thinking, well, is that something you should watch as a bear thesis for uranium right now? And the answer is no, because the dynamics that we have in this sector, and the reason why you can be very confident about the uranium outlook as a commodity, is because it's a supply-driven story. It's not a demand-driven story. If something happened and all of the prospective new builds around the world were placed on hold, just the existing fleet of nuclear power stations around the world would drive this sector forward, because we're in a structural deficit and there isn't enough supply coming on that can feed those nuclear power plants. So over the medium term, as you've identified, whilst this sector can be stubborn for months on end, if utilities are not contracting and if they're not buying, out to the end of that time frame in 2 years to 3 years, something will simply have to give, because there isn't enough inventory sitting in fuel buyers' converter accounts around the world. There isn't enough uranium as inventory for them to do nothing for a period of 18 to 24 months.
Brandon, thank you for that. I think the audience should make sure that they understand the baseline here is very important, and that is the existing fleet. What is the existing fleet doing? And existing fleet would include restarts, situations where you either have a restart or you even have a plant that's been shut down, that was in permanent shutdown, but now is being considered for rehabilitation and restart as well. So when you look at that baseline, same. When you look at that in itself is the baseline for all of the work. Forget about the SMRs, forget about everything else, forget about climate if you're on board with that or not, doesn't matter. That's all icing on the cake. If it happens, great, but let's just stick with the existing consumption of the commercial fleet, and then of course the other uses of material as well, naval applications, etc. want to move on here and actually come into energy, which ties in, of course, to this, Brandon. We have to look at energy as part of this. And of course, I want to get to Bannerman here in a moment, but just wanted to stop on energy just because of your exposure to it and your level of knowledge and the work that you do in the energy side as well. Of course, we have these various sources of energy out there, Brandon, some of them quite poor, as you know, from fossil fuels to what is called the renewables class, although, of course, many of those renewables, the inputs there aren't necessarily renewable. They all have a footprint. You've got a few exotics, and then, of course, you've got those, in my view, in a class of their own, which would be commercial nuclear energy. So there's a wide variation of energy sources. My question is for you is, what does quality of energy mean to you when you hear that term? And you having been involved with this industry for so long and having studied it for many years, what do you see now as quality of energy in Brandon Munro's view?
This is such a good conversation to be having at the moment, Andrew, because I like the way you put it, quality of energy. There's a lot of misunderstandings about quantity of energy, and we're seeing in the Australian debate that's taking place at the moment that a vast majority of the population across different education levels, different industries, different socioeconomic advantages, the whole lot. You can take a broad section of Australian society and most people can't tell you the difference between an output and a capacity. In other words, they interchangeably use the maximum capacity that a wind turbine has with its output. And there's a vast difference in the quality of energy because probably, as most of your listeners would understand, the average wind farm output is 30 to 40% of its capacity. So 1 gigawatt capacity is generating the equivalent of a 300 to 400 megawatt coal-fired or nuclear power station. So quality is really starting to become the measure and the benchmark for the achievability of our industrial civilization. And the reason it's becoming so important now is poor quality energy sources are having their impacts recognized more broadly. For a long period of time, solar and wind in particular had a free ride because they weren't penetrating grids to such an extent that the on costs of that penetration were being felt, recognized, or measured. So what do I mean by that? Well, in a typical grid, you can optimize solar, and there's some great things about solar and wind, right? I'm not going to, I've worked in renewables myself. I'm in their right place, they're fantastic. And the great thing about solar is at a small degree of penetration in the right environment, it can produce very cheap electricity, but only for a certain period of the day and only in the right grid configuration where that cheap energy has a value, because there's many examples where cheap solar is not actually used because there's too much of it. So in a typical grid for many years, intermittent renewables could feed in at about 15 or 20%, and they were simply value accretive because other sources such as gas peaking could flex around them. There wasn't a need for massive transmission to be built because that level of renewables can be built around existing infrastructure, and that's great. That is progress. But then what happened is somewhere along the lines, the lobby group and the financiers of this form of infrastructure figured out that they could find a curious bedfellow in that portion of the environmental body that was more interested in signalling than results. And I'm distinguishing that group of people from genuine conservationists, from genuine ecologists, from genuine environmentalists who are all about what are the results here, such as the Finnish Greens Party, who, for example, have a pro-nuclear policy because they understand it is the most favourable energy source for the environment. Now, these curious bedfellows managed to get hold of a pretty naive society and convince people that the idea of 80 or 90 or even 100% renewables was a thing, was something that could be aspired for, was a realistic goal. And many people still believe in their hearts that if it was just for more political will, we'd all be running off 100% renewables right now. And unfortunately, it's going to go down as one of the great lies of the 21st century, that you can operate a modern grid on substantially renewable power in the next several decades without balancing that with baseload and quality of energy. And what happens is, as a penetration of intermittent renewables starts to expand beyond 20, 25, 30%, it does depend a little bit on the nature of the grid itself, it starts to externalize its costs. So for a long time, the externalized cost was to basically take value away from coal-fired power stations. So the cost of coal-fired power went up, but no one really cared because it's those terrible coal people, and we don't mind if they pay more. Now, of course, at a society economic level, it's robbing Peter to pay Paul, but it was okay because you're promoting an energy source that's perceived as being good at the cost of an energy source that's perceived as being bad. Nuclear power, unfortunately, was also a heavy recipient of that, of those penalties, particularly in the US, where the way that intermittent renewable subsidies were structured is that in many cases they could continue to be paid subsidies even when they were producing unnecessary power that was leading to congestion charges being levied on any energy source that couldn't turn itself off quickly enough. So for a nuclear power plant that was 4 hours away from needing to be on at full capacity when everyone got home from work and needed to turn their cookers on, they couldn't just turn themselves off or the lights would go off at night. So they'd have to keep operating during the afternoon when the sun was shining and the wind was blowing in Ohio, and they paid big congestion charges. And the intermittent operators would only turn off feeding into the grid when the congestion charges that they were paying exceeded the subsidies that they were earning. That's an example of where it just doesn't work, and the quality of energy ends up costing a society and costing the future of a society in a way that doesn't make any sense. People are now starting to realize in their power bills, policymakers are starting to realize, because they've been given the job of solving for net zero 2050, and even politicians are starting to realize through the comments in their constituencies that energy quality really matters. The return of energy on energy invested, in other words, how much energy do you get from a energy production source versus how much energy you need to put into making that source in the first place, counts. Dispatchability and baseload count enormously. The ability to provide energy during major climatic events like polar vortexes, like floods, like hurricanes, that counts, because you can't just say, oh, sorry, everyone, there's a hurricane today, we're turning the lights and the power off in the hospital. Because people lose their lives that way. And a whole lot of other critical infrastructure, including data centers, must continue to be powered no matter what's happening. And there is only one source of energy in the known world today that can continue producing during all of those extreme climatic events. And that is, no surprise to people listening to this podcast, it's nuclear power. So there is an ultimate form of quality energy, which is nuclear power, versus some other forms where they can play a role, and they play a very positive role in decreasing the cost of the grid when they are used proportionately and appropriately. And most of the industrialized world has been convinced that the laws of physics and the engineering associated with the operation of electrical grids and other energy systems around the world simply don't apply, because lobbyists and proponents of particular energy sources have said it enough that everyone believes it. And that just isn't the case. There's some laws of nature that we cannot defy, no matter how often and how furtively and how appealingly you say otherwise. So I love the way that you put it. Quality of energy is becoming the new focus. And one final comment on that. I talked about the evolution from the early positive impact of intermittent renewables on electricity grids in particular. And it was all good back in those days because you can introduce, as I say, 15, 20, even 25% intermittent energy into a grid without it costing somebody and therefore costing society at large. That came at the same time as these power sources were becoming very cheap. There was definitely an economy of scale involved in producing more PV sources of supply and upscaling wind turbines and so on. By and large, that period of decreasing cost is now finished. The financing of these infrastructure projects is much more expensive. Subsidies that were only ever supposed to be temporary to help an infant industry get up and running are rolling off. And that's happening at the same time where the impacts of poor energy policy are starting to bite. We now need to make a choice between sensible energy policy and prosperity going forward. And that's being compounded by one final driver for quality of energy. That is that people, policymakers, industry, strategic planners, people who just have an interest in the long-term prosperity of the world, like you and me, we're starting to grapple with, well, what happens when you need to go beyond simply decarbonising an electricity grid? What happens when you need to decarbonise industrial heating, chemical production, refining of other energy sources, concrete, steel, fertiliser? What happens when you need to take the carbon footprint out of everyday life? Because that's vastly more complicated than simply taking a high carbon electricity source and replacing it with a low carbon electricity source. And that's when the quality of energy will become extremely important. And the world is going to have to make a decision between really three choices. Choice number one, continue with fossil fuels together with other forms of energy that are high density, high quality, but have a cost in carbon cost. Choice number two, move towards higher quality, low carbon sources of energy. And really that's just hydro and nuclear power. Choice number three, inevitably and necessarily impose a substantial decay of medium-term prosperity on the world, and in particular, the developed world. They're the three choices. There's no way of getting away from those three choices. And I love working in this sector because that's the choice with nuclear power and hydro where it's available. That's the choice where you can have prosperity and you can improve the overall ecology of the world by reducing a carbon footprint.
Very well said, Brandon. I appreciate you going through all that. It's a real challenge here to make sure that people start to understand the importance of quality of energy. It's just now starting to get out there a little bit that this is something that has to be considered, and that in the U.S., according to the EIA, wind and solar consists of about just over 14% of the national grid. If that's the case, and we're already starting to see cracks, then that's interesting in itself. Just this is U.S. as an example. It's not going to apply to every country, but you're already starting to see the cracks there. Then, as you said, the subsidies are starting to roll off. The honeymoon, if you will, is starting to come to an end with respect to component life cycle replacement of parts, and all the things that were done 10 years ago or thereabouts are starting to come home to roost. And also this is happening where societies are starting to realize that these are policy failures that have also been propagated in a way that has had false information. This is happening at the same time. And so it's going to be a very interesting couple of years ahead here as people continue to grapple with this. And, I have to say, come back and pick on Australia for a moment. I hope you'll forgive me. But it's funny for Australia, a country that doesn't have any commercial reactors, but the country has zero problem whatsoever selling piles of coal, gas, uranium, and other minerals that participate in the production of energy from sources that Australia doesn't use themselves. this is a bad analogy, but this is the only one I can think of, is the guy that makes the drug. Well, we make it, but we don't use it. We just sell it. We don't use it ourselves. And it's kind of like that. Australia sells tons of coal, a huge coal production in Australia. And coal, of course, as you well know, I'm not defending fossil fuels here, but they have been a pleasant source of energy for countries that are going through its life cycle. It's not like you can be born as a country and immediately deploy a reactor. You have to start out and you have to upgrade and get your way up there. And I think that's perfectly clear that countries, as they develop, seek those elevated forms of quality of energy. And so, anyway, just those are the other thoughts I had as you were talking there about these various issues. So I really appreciate you going through all that, and I'll take any comments before we move on, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. I won't spend the next hour talking about the vast cognitive dissonance in Australia's energy policy. It is an absolute mess. It's a desperate mess, and Australia is an enormously privileged country, an enormously privileged society, a very strong economy, and that's largely been through natural resources, starting with agriculture and then evolving into mining. And that's all at risk because if we can't have reliable energy in the country that I'm recording from at the moment, we don't have a strong services sector. We don't have a strong manufacturing sector that we can fall back on. I mean, it's the good times will not continue to roll in Australia, and we're not a particularly resilient country. We're not big enough to just shrug that off and get on with life. If we stuff up energy policy, which the government that's in power at the moment is racing headlong to do, the way of life that Australians have become very well adapted to and frankly take for granted won't continue for too much longer. But let's not go into that because there's too much to be said. What is interesting though is let's talk about coal for a moment. Not in a value or in a value judgment way, just in a pure how the world works way. And that is, as you say, the climate battle is going to be won and lost, not in Brussels, not in New York, not in the hearts and minds of the people who donate to Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth. It's going to be won in the dust of the developing world or lost. And that's just how it is because, having lived in Africa and traveled extensively through the developing world, their main priority is not what's happening in the climate. They've got much bigger fish to fry in terms of big challenges with their own societies, high expectations, closing the gap between the way that their people live and the way that they see the developed, privileged world living. And one of the most important bridges between current lifestyle and lack of opportunities in the developed world and where they want to be, that bridge is energy. And as you say, if you don't have cheap hydro available because of the topography and weather systems in your own country, you're going to go to the most available, cheapest and fastest to deploy energy source. And that still is coal. And there are pockets of the privileged world who want to kid themselves that if we just teach these people properly, they'll do more wind and solar. And that is just garbage. That's garbage thinking. It's the result of people who spend their entire lives in a bubble and don't understand properly what's driving the developed world and what they're entitled to aspire to. So then you bring that back to Australian coal. Well, a lot of Australian coal is being sold to China and India. And if they weren't using high quality Australian coal, which has got very high calorific value, which has got low impurities, which is actually, as far as coal goes, about as good as you get, they'd be burning the garbage coal that they can get elsewhere. So curiously, when you take the passion out of the debate and you just look at what is the net environmental impact for a given set of unchangeable circumstances in the medium term, the unchangeable circumstance being they're not going to turn their coal-fired power stations off and further entrench poverty just because the Western world's telling them they should, burning Australian coal is, in the short term, advantageous to the environment versus burning whatever awful lignite they can get their hands on that's perhaps a bit closer to their own market. Over time, one of the effects that the global energy transition has had is it has made coal-fired power in the developing world cheaper rather than more expensive. Now, I appreciate, coal prices are high at the moment, but over a decade-long basis, the West's reduction in reliance on coal has made it cheaper in many respects for the developing world to build. And because we haven't given them viable alternatives, because the West had a huge swing against nuclear power for 10 years, we will see more coal being burnt in the developing world. And again, the choice that I articulated for the privileged world or the developed world or the Western world, not even the Western world, but the world that has a degree of economic security, there's a slightly different choice that the developing world needs to make, but it's more blunt. It's, do we have energy of any description? Because if we don't, we're not going to have prosperity. And in many cases, the people that are being served by the leadership of those countries, they just want the basics like a washing machine that's inside their hut or their house. They just want to have power to their door so that they can turn lights on and not burn candles. And they want to heat with something that's not animal dung and wood. It's really, really basic choices. And what I hope to be part of is offering more nuclear power into those countries so that they're able to achieve what they absolutely need to in terms of progression and closing that prosperity gap without exerting a carbon toll that the world at large needs to absorb.
Brandon, lots of stuff there. We could talk multiple podcasts. We could do a whole series over months talking about this issue alone. You're a person that actually understands it because you've witnessed it firsthand. You've experienced it firsthand. Whereas many people, I'll go back and I'll beat on the United States a bit here, have not got out of their own home state or even their own home country and look at the world through that lens of no experience. And it's unfortunate that they've been put in that position. And part of it's the inherent system itself that has put them in that position to where they can't see it. So I always suggest people to understand that every country is in a different stage in its life cycle. Privileged countries, as you say, or economic, more secure countries will not dictate to the developing world whether or not they turn off their air conditioning or turn it on or how they get their energy. They're going to seek their own self-determination. And that in itself is why this most likely does not work. And that's just the diversity of disagreement, diversity of where you are on the curve. And obviously, the people who seek opportunity that haven't been presented with the same opportunities that we've been presented with, they're going to seek those. They may fail, just like people that we know have tried and failed, but they're nonetheless still going to seek it. And that in itself is the biggest piece here that drives exactly what you want to do. And my same positivity around commercial reactors and deploying those. And as you said, it's been set back, the last decade, as you said, but even before that, there was no shortage of coal and oil and gas lobbies that made sure that it got set back because you want to make sure that your biggest competitor is put out of business if you can. And certainly there's ways, means, and methods to do that. And it certainly has been done for a period of time, basically from the 60s until now, or at least until a couple of years ago anyway, Brandon. So that's a whole nother piece as well as how this has been so delayed through this period of time as well. And of course, how fear mongering has been utilized to make sure that it stayed reasonably suppressed through this period of time. Why don't we leave it there? Because I know we could keep going on that. Why don't we get right into Bannerman here? I wanted to start off more along the lines of administrative and get started there. But the company in late June did close on a 85 million Australian dollar placement during late June. The company is on the final steps towards a construction decision for the Etango project. Just give us an overall update of where we are on progressing the project, and then we'll get into some details.
Let's turn on to a more positive note after articulating all of the big energy challenges of the world. So Bannerman Energy, we have the Etango project in Namibia. It is a very, very large ore body, one of the largest undeveloped ore bodies for uranium in the world. More than 200 million pounds. It's open at depth. It has satellite deposits. I'm absolutely confident that with more drilling, we could make it bigger. We just don't need to do anytime soon. The Etango project itself will produce initially 3.5 million pounds per annum. That's enough for 7 or 8 gigawatts of nuclear power, 7 to 8 conventional sized nuclear reactors. And we've published an expansion study where we would double our throughput to produce 6.7 million pounds from the early 2030s. So we are a 6.7 million pound producer in the development phase, with the key advantage that there is a two-step process with all of the risk attenuation that you get with that. So where do we find ourselves at the moment? Well, I'm delighted to say that since the last time you and I spoke, Andrew, we're now fully permitted. We have all of our environmental permits, all of our heritage permits. We have our mining license, and that enables us to both construct and operate the Etango mine, including the expanded version of it. Since we got our mining license at the end of last year, that's become the big enabler for us to now start on our pre-construction infrastructure. So we've recently completed the access road to site, and we've also completed the temporary water pipeline, and we are now filling the on-site reservoir. That's a temporary pipeline of water for construction water. We didn't want to be in a position where we'd be making concrete, where we'd be suppressing dust and all of the other construction activities that require water at the logistical and cost whim of trucking it in, because we're in a desert. And we've made an environmental decision not to tap groundwater, and therefore we are reliant on desalinated water. So we've got that flowing. We've got the access road to site. We're very lucky because of the infrastructure around us, so they weren't big undertakings. What the raising now does is it enables us to do all of the on-site infrastructure. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So it broadly fits into two categories. The first category of what we're doing is construction infrastructure. So that's the access road that's ticked, the temporary water pipeline that's ticked. What we're about to start now is a temporary power line, which means that we've got grid power to start our construction activities rather than relying on gensets. It includes the on-site roadworks. This is a big uranium mine. The ore body itself stretches for almost 6 kilometres. So as you can imagine, it's a big site, and there's a lot of roads that need to be built on the site itself, connecting all of the various aspects of mining and processing and administration and so on. So for us, they're construction infrastructure items that mean that we are remaining shovel ready, construction ready to go. Now, the second category is the actual construction itself. And with this raising and having 100 million Aussie in the bank now, we can proceed with some of the genuine construction activities. Activities that would normally only start once you're drawing down debt, for example, in a very conventional financing. First of all, that's detailed design. So we're continuing with detailed design throughout this year and ensuring that all of the detailed design for the different components of this construction are fully in place. But the key is what's called the bulk earthworks contract. And there's two very important aspects to that. The first is, this is a heap leach mine. So the processing is by heap leaching rather than tank leaching. The great thing about that is there's a lot less equipment. You don't have milling, you're just crushing with very standardized crushers. You don't have the complex milling equipment that tends to be long lead items, tends to be expensive, is quite complicated in the way that it needs to be constructed. It's simply a big heap. Now, what it does mean, though, is that it's got a larger earthworks component than you would normally expect for a mine and a processing plant that operates according to tank leaching. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the crushing equipment and the primary crusher. You have to get that right in the way that the earthworks is done to accommodate that big kit, the big primary crusher, and then the 2 secondary crushers and the tertiary crusher. So we want to start all of that now, and that's the bulk earthworks contract. It's about a $30 million Australian contract. So we needed to do the raising to be able to start it. It's a 24-month contract, and it sets the backbone for our timing. So this is the work that we needed to commence to be able to be sure that we can be producing uranium in 2027. And that's what the raising enables us to do. So that's something that's genuine construction. We've now got, because we've started that 24-month contract, that now gives us time and flexibility to decide over time, well, what other construction activities do we want to start sooner rather than later? What do we need to do to maintain that 2027 production date? And that's a great position to be in, because we've got the cash balance and the balance sheet to have that flexibility. With that major contract now soon to be awarded, we've got a degree of flexibility on the way that we proceed with construction, and having all of our ducks lined up in a marketing sense, we've got some flexibility as to how we manage the interaction between writing long-term contracts and financing the project. So it's in a really good space. I'm delighted with how our strategy has played out over the last couple of years. It means that I'm not losing sleep about the market, the uranium market being soggy at the moment, because I feel confident that by the end of this year, the good times from a uranium producer are going to be rolling, and we're perfectly positioned to optimize those positive dynamics that we expect to see.
I want to get into cap structure here for a moment, and then I want to come back and talk a few other things on the progression of the project, get your thoughts on a few other items. We talked a little bit, or you mentioned a little bit about term contracting just at the end there. Get back to that. On capital structure, though, can you just give us an update, because it's been a while? Talk where we are on the shares outstanding at the company, the total cash in the bank now, and that total position, and then where you think that gets you as far as pre-construction activities, and then also major shareholders, including management on the roster.
At the moment, we've got a very simple capital structure. So it's simply ordinary shares and a relatively small number of options and performance rights, which are part of our employee share plan. There's 175 million shares on issue. We're trading at about $3 Australian. We will issue a few more shares that are subject to shareholder approval. So that notice of meeting is out. Any shareholders tuning in, please vote for that. And once that's completed, we'll have about 100 million Australian dollars in the bank, ready to deploy into those contracts that I mentioned. So the bulk earthworks contract is about a $30 million contract. We'll spend over the course of this year probably about $10 million on the detailed design, and the other items that I mentioned will probably aggregate into another $6 or $7 million. Corporate overheads are pretty tight still, and we want to keep it that way. So that gives you a picture as to we'll end this calendar year still in a very robust position. We used the capital raising very effectively to build some big names on our register, and I'm delighted with the quality of the institutions that came in. You would know yourself, Andrew, that the timing of the raising meant that we had a lot of work to do. It was not one of those times in the market when people just throw money at you. We got a good result. Nonetheless, it just meant that there was a little bit more strategy and a bit more effort required than you would get when things are really frothy. But the upside of that was that we only had quality, patient, long-only fundamental names who wanted to cornerstone that raising. And so it meant that we brought really good quality names onto the register who weren't looking at the uranium and Bannerman because it's just a trendy commodity of the month. They were fundamental uranium investors who are interested in the long-term progression of this company. So we've increased our institutional and professional component. It was at about 30%. We've now increased it by the amount of that raise. So we're up towards getting towards 50% now, which is helpful. Of that, almost 15% are ETFs. And for investors looking in and wondering if Bannerman is going to give them a lot of leverage as this sector starts to heat up and as sentiment comes back into this sector, particularly over the next 3 to 6 months, that's a key metric to follow, because when a large proportion of your register is represented by uranium ETFs, sentiment becomes a huge driver for share price. And we've seen that several times over the last few years. When sentiment has improved and ETFs are being capitalized, the pressure that that puts on our liquidity and the pressure that that puts on our share price is easily demonstrated and easily seen. So I'm delighted that we're in all of the uranium ETFs. It says great things about our company in general, but what it also means is that we will be a preferred recipient of improving sentiment over the course of this year. In terms of board and management, we've got, we're a decent sized company, so in percentage terms, it's 4 to 5% of the company's represented by board and management, but in absolute terms, for most of the people that I'm working with here, it's a game changer in terms of the amount of their family's financial security that's represented by the employee shares, options and rights that they've got in the company. So it's a very motivated team anyway, but have made sure that that motivation is complemented by quite deep financial integration and financial reward for the team here. And it's been, at a personal level, it's been one of the very most rewarding things for me to see the people who've poured their heart and soul into this company during a pretty tough time, since in some cases as early as 2010, now becoming really quite wealthy people on paper, as the shares that they've slowly accumulated in this company via its employee incentive plan have in many cases gone up 10 or 15 times. So we've got a management team that's extremely motivated, that are high quality people in their own right, who've got tremendous skills that have been carefully assimilated into this team to make sure that our team truly can stand up to the best teams in this sector, in many cases for companies who are an order of magnitude larger than us. So that's how we have ensured that we've got a very strong degree of alignment between the board and management and our shareholders, as well as many steps that we take to ensure that our Namibian stakeholders are represented in our thinking, and that we've got alignment with those two key groups, our investors and our shareholders, and our local Namibian communities, government, and other stakeholders.
Brandon, thank you for that. Another measure, of course, is percentage of net worth in this particular venture. And when people look at it on that type of a basis, you also have to weigh that factor as well. So I appreciate your comments and how you handled that question. Adds additional thought for the audience about how that evaluation is, of course, is done, and very well should be rewarded in the sense that this company has progressed over the time that we've been here, take it back to 16 or so. And you look at the value creation here and the fact that it is moving down the road, very well appreciated, and should be that there's value there for the management team and their efforts going down the road as well. With respect to people at the company, which we touched on just a little bit here, maybe just, and I know there's a lot of folks there, and I don't expect you to go through all of them, but definitely most recently there's been some additions as you guys gear up to become an operator. Just talk about some of those additional folks that have come along and stepped into roles to help push this company into the stage of an operating cash flowing company in the future.
This is a topic I love talking about because I am really proud of the team that we've been able to put together. And you know full well, Andrew, that good people attract good people. and a good sector, in our case, an absolutely outstanding sector, attracts outstanding people. And in many cases, the people that we've attracted have come out of a broader resources sector, primarily because they want to get involved in nuclear energy. They want to be part of the solution. The most important appointment that we've made in recent times, since you and I last chatted, was promoting Gavin Chamberlain to Chief Executive Officer. So many people still associate the CEO role with myself, but in fact, at the beginning of this year, I've stepped to, I'm not sure if it's up, sideways, down, or around, but I've moved from CEO to Executive Chairman. What that means in practice is that I have passed on the operational day-to-day responsibilities to Gavin Chamberlain as our CEO, but I still remain in an executive capacity. I'm still putting out plenty of hours. I'm traveling. I'm still fully engaged in Bannerman, but in a more flexible way, because I'm not absorbed with the day-to-day operating and technical and development aspects of this business. I can be more strategic. I can remain market focused, and in a large part that provides the ability to remain as a flexible resource managing the financing of the project. So let's talk about Gavin. Why did we appoint Gavin, and why am I so excited about it? So as CEO, I think I can say that I did a pretty good job in stewarding this asset forward. It was largely a corporate role. When I took on the role in 2016, most of the work was done on the asset. I inherited a tremendous positive legacy because of the data that had been done. And the hard work was really stewarding the asset through a bear market, spending appropriately on it without diluting shareholders, and ensuring that we had a trajectory of shareholder value creation between then and when the market ultimately and inevitably recovered. And so I think a good measure of that is in 2016, when I started, I took a placement in the company at market, which was 30 cents in today's measures. And so now we're trading above $3. And I think whilst it's required a lot of patience over that journey, it's been an appropriate reward for that patience. That role, that corporate role, becomes very, very different when you start moving into construction. And as you start getting a project ready to be an operator, to be a genuine, real producer of uranium. And so that's why we felt as a board it was extremely important that the person running the company had to be a person who's built mines before, who's got deep resources experience. For anyone tuning in for the first time, my background is in economics and law. And whilst I was a pretty good lawyer in the day, that doesn't really help you at all when it comes to constructing a mine. So Gavin is a proven Southern African mine builder. He's been doing it for 30 years. He's been building mines and other infrastructure predominantly in Southern Africa, but he's done enough stuff in really funky Africa, difficult Africa, to have sharpened his sword. And he's got highly relevant experience as well. So he was the project director who built the Husab uranium mine, which to this day is the largest uranium mine in Africa and the largest mine in Namibia by capex. That saw him in and out of Namibia for 5 or 6 years. He was in charge of the construction joint venture. It was such a big project that it was a joint venture between South African firms Bateman and Amec Foster Wheeler, which is today Wood, who remains our lead consulting engineer. And as well as that, he's had experience as a contractor, as a constructor of mines, and also on the owners team. And I wanted that balance. I didn't want someone who spent their entire career inside an engineering firm who didn't understand what it's like to be on the other side of the fence, managing engineering firms, for example. And Gavin's got those 3 dimensions, deep experience in all 3 of those dimensions in the African context. And he lives in Cape Town, which is fantastic because at the 2-hour flight, there's daily flights from Cape Town to very near our project. There's an international airport at Walfish Bay. So he's got the advantage of being very close to the project. That's been important for us because, first of all, for an investor in our company, they should see the value of that de-risking. We've now got someone who has built mines that are quite literally an order of magnitude more complex than Etango, with deep experience, who is overseeing all of the risk mitigations and all of the execution steps that we need to take. So that's a big plus. But what it also does is it sends a really strong message to our industry partners and our utilities that we're getting on with the job. Someone of Gavin's caliber would not come into the CEO role if he was expecting to be sitting around waiting for something to happen. We are moving forward with this mine and moving forward with the expansion of the mine as well to become a 6.7 million pound uranium producer. A couple of other key appointments. Olga Skolyakova was a gem that we were able to hire just over a year ago. Olga's been in the sector for a long time, in the nuclear sector. She's not simply a uranium salesperson. She's far deeper than that, far more strategic. She deeply understands the entire nuclear fuel cycle. I mean, we talk about what's happening in the US at the moment. Well, 15 years ago, Olga was selling enrichment in the US market, as well as all of the involvement that she's had in uranium. So real pedigree background in the nuclear and uranium fuel cycle. Most recently, she spent 7 years with World Nuclear Association. And my deep working relationship with Olga was because she was in charge of publishing WNA's nuclear fuel report and all of the associated supply and demand modelling that WNA did. So apart from needing to deal with me, because for 4 of those years I was the co-chair of the demand subgroup, she also needed to herd 80 different cats in the form of she had 80 senior executives throughout the global nuclear sector that formed part of the various working groups that reported to her as part of the publication of this really flagship report that WNA does. So that's all I need to say to give you a feel for just how deep her network is in the sector and how well she is liked and appreciated in the sector. Some of the other depth that we've got operationally is Werner Ewald. He was in charge of mining at the Rossing uranium mine. He's been with us for a long time. He is the face of Bannerman in Namibia and a really important reason for why we are so liked and so appreciated and got such strong social license in country. Steve Hurley, he is our CFO. He was globally BHP Iron Ore's financial controller. He sat on BHP's global strategy and leadership team. There's enormous projects that he undertook whilst at BHP in technology and mining systems, in ERP systems, in change management. So he's got this really, really deep operating experience from a super major, but he's also worked in smaller companies during his career, including some sort of household entrepreneurial names in the Australian context. So he's got that fabulous balance of understanding how real mining companies do things, but also having a deep appreciation for what we need to be at Bannerman, which is a nimble and entrepreneurial outfit as we achieve those goals. So they're the people that I wanted to highlight for you. The strategy around building our team has been attract high quality people. So the All Blacks, as I think you know, Andrew, the All Blacks are, as much as I hate to say it because it's a Kiwi rugby team, they're probably the most successful sporting team on the planet over the longer term, and they've got a no dickheads policy. We've adopted a similar approach with our culture. They're very good, extremely passionate people who are very capable and very excellence focused. Plus, we've ensured that that team has got deep uranium experience and deep Namibian experience, because having that deep experience in those 2 key areas across our exco means that we've got more flexibility to hire mining people out of other resources backgrounds to get our mine up and running. And in Namibia, it's a vibrant mining sector with lots of people. So that's something that's really achievable for us as we move forward. So that's been our approach, Andrew. And as I say, I'm really proud of it, really delighted with how the team works together. They're kicking goals the whole time. And I can stand up to anyone in this sector and say, my team's as good as yours.
You guys have built that over time, and I think the market's rewarded Bannerman over the years for that effort and also bringing on capable people. And so very interested to see how all these people come together here to get this mine built in the near term and get things operating, and very excited to see the progress on that front happen. Appreciate a lot of the folks there certainly have a number of years of experience. I know a couple of them, and I think we're setting up very well here to move this down to the path that we all want, and that is cash flowing company that's operating and producing a product and making a profit. Obviously, that's so important as well. That's what incentivizes people to do things. So, yeah, back to a couple things. You mentioned desalinated water. Really can appreciate your efforts to utilize desalination. It's a technology and an infrastructure that has been underutilized around this world in many places that should have utilized it many decades ago. And of course, some places are suffering as a result of not utilizing it. And so can always appreciate that and your guys' decisions to use desalinated water. Of course, you mentioned the 85 million was just a bit harder for you to raise. I have to laugh a little bit on that and just say where the company is today, and of course your abilities. I suspect it maybe was just a little bit harder, Brandon, but still I think fairly easy compared to some of the smaller companies and some of the other companies in the sector that have tremendous challenge raising capital in these conditions. So I wanted to congratulate you on that. I want to circle back to contracting for a moment. And I want you to just, if you can here, I know there's a strategy behind this and you're not going to unveil it here on a podcast, but talk about the utility book for Bannerman, what the strategy is, what you can tell us, and if investors can expect some news on this Bannerman utility book in the coming months. And when I say coming months, I'm talking in the next few quarters.
Right, one of my favorite topics, as you can imagine. Let's just break it down for people, first of all, particularly for new audience members who are still with us. The way that it works with long-term contracts in our sector is that a supplier, Bannerman, will sign up with a utility, and that's typically for delivery in, let's say, 3 years' time, commencing 3 years' time, typically for 5 to 7 years. So hence the long-term contracts. There are other ways to sell uranium. There's quite a vibrant mid-term market at the moment for selling uranium for delivery in, say, 12 to 24 to 36 months. But let's focus on long-term contracts. The pricing structure for those contracts tends to be one or the other, or a combination of fixed price or market related. Now, what does that mean? Fixed price contracts, you nominate a base price that in current market conditions then gets escalated, e.g. for US inflation. So you might say, you pick a round number, the spot price is at $86 at the moment. Let's say you would nominate $85 and you'd say, and we're going to escalate that over the life of the contract by 85% of US inflation. And you pick a metric and you write that in. So that's that's the fixed price. And there's a lot of secondary terms, but they're the key ones for people to understand. Then a market-related price is when the uranium is delivered, you get the spot price at the time, according to various measures that you write into the contract, potentially affected by a floor and a ceiling. So for us, we would insist on floors because we can, and because we would always want to lock in the long-term resilience of our project and the long-term profitability. Now, of course, if you insist on a floor, then you have to offer a corresponding ceiling. There isn't contracting being done in the sector at the moment. Like, we're really in a dead patch because of US sanctions. But the last couple of contracts have been written. We understand that the market-related component is something like a $75 floor and a $130 ceiling. So that gives you an idea of what the market was at, let's say, a month ago. The combination is utilities at the moment, as you can imagine, when you compare those two examples. The utilities, they want fixed price contracts because they want to lock in current pricing. And by and large, the producers want market related because they can see that the uranium price is going up and they want to be getting, more of the delivery price that's closer to 130 than 75 or 80. So the contracts right now tend to be a blend. So the utilities are saying, look, I tell you what, we'll give you the market related for, let's say, 60% of the deliveries, but we need fixed price for 40%. And we're in a relatively balanced negotiating position right now that we anticipate will become more of a seller's market as this year moves on. So there's the basics. There's the contracting 101. Before I move on to talk about sort of how it relates to our project, are there any questions or any clarifications, Andrew, that we should squeeze in?
Yeah, sure. Let me just add in there that folks need to understand what is the quality of those contracts. What I can say about Bannerman here so far is them, like a handful of others, have been able and actually, to be honest, knew their own company so well and the market conditions so well and the underlying fundamentals so well that they didn't get sucked into signing $50 contracts like a few participants have out there. And I don't care what method of mining you're doing, 50 may not necessarily be a good choice looking back. We've seen some instances of this happening to try to prove up the legitimacy of a company. You'll see also that there are certain parties that have not done that and now look very good because they didn't do that. I just want to stop there. So, quality of contracting is important, and the quality of contracting is hard to determine without details because these are generally mostly confidential. They're hard to sort out. You can do some work and sort some of them out, but you don't really start seeing the full picture of those until the financial results start to flow in. And so those are the things I wanted to add, Brandon, and obviously those are in your favor.
Thank you. Look, it's nice to hear you saying that because because we've been talking so much over the journey, but for investors new to Bannerman, this has been exactly the situation we wanted to be in. And it didn't happen by accident. It wasn't by pure luck that we found ourselves holding out on what could have been attractive contracts in the 50s and the 60s. It was a huge amount of corporate planning and corporate strategy and doing the work required to have a view on the uranium sector where I was confident going to my board and my other stakeholders and saying, no, we must hold out because it will go up. Andrew, that I've been consistent with my expectations of where the minimum incentive price would need to be, i.e. above $80 a pound. And that was pretty hard to stand up at a conference and say that when the uranium price was under $20 a pound. But that's what I did. And, some people laughed and some people gasped and some people thought, well, this guy knows what he's talking about. But we were consistent with that belief and we'd done enough work to have that view and made our decisions around that. And part of what we had to do was remain flexible so that we would have choices as uranium started to push through $65, and when we could easily have written contracts if we'd wanted to at those sort of levels. Well, we made sure that we had the cash balance. We made sure that we were moving the project forward. We made sure that we had a strategy that gave us the flexibility to say thanks, but no thanks at those sort of pricing levels. So thank you for raising that. I probably need to get a little bit better at beating my own drum with some of those, the value of some of those corporate decisions that we made along the journey. So coming back to what we're looking to do, we've got some real advantages with Etango. The primary advantage is that it's a simple mine. It'll be quite literally the simplest mining operation in our sector. It's an outcropping, open cast ore body. It's got very low stripping ratio. The heap leaching is very straightforward, and we've operated a pilot plant for several years to give us absolute confidence for ourselves, for our financiers, for the utilities in how well that heap leaching works, and the economics are good. So it's a very simple operation, and that helps a lot when it comes to engaging with utilities. The way that it works with contracting is for our production, our initial production of 3.5 million pounds, we're probably going to have 10 or 12 contracts in total. And we get the opportunity to layer those contracts in as the market improves. So the pricing terms on the first contracts that we decide to write, we would then hope that you then use that contract to build further confidence amongst a broader group of utilities and then continue layering those contracts in. To ultimately, by the time we're ready to start production or by the time we're commissioning the mine after construction, we've got somewhere between 60 and 80% of our production under contract that has been that is a portfolio of contracts that have been written at successively improved economic terms. And here's the great thing about our project. We can then expand. We've then got the option, the choice, but not the obligation to expand from 3.5 million pounds to 6.7 million pounds. So I'm not going to have any regret cost if we've got a portfolio with a value of X and this market surprises us all and goes to 3X, because then we've got all of this new production that we can contract at 3X. And the way that the expansion works so beautifully is we will need to make a final investment decision on the reinvestment in the project to undertake the expansion once we've been producing uranium for about 2 years. So in other words, we've been producing it, we've won everyone's confidence, we've been delivering into our contracts. I expect we'll have a market where those customers are coming back to us saying, well, come on, when can we get some more? We need to lock in some more. And so that additional or incremental contracting process will be quite straightforward for us. And we don't have to expand. We can choose our own timing. We can choose whether to expand or not. This isn't an expansion to get at the good quality ore body or an expansion to create economies of scale. If we don't expand because we don't want to or we don't need to, we'll just keep producing at 3.5 million pounds for decades. But if the market's there for us as we expect, then we will expand, and from an absolute position of strength with existing contracts, with an existing production capability, making deliveries already, we would then rewrite contracts to finance the expansion of the project to get to that 6.7 million pounds. So it's a little bit like having a pipeline of assets, but a very low risk pipeline, because our second asset, our second production centre, is a brownfields expansion of what would at that point be an already successful mine. So then bringing that back to contracting, it means that in addition to the advantage that we've got of low risk and simple production and processing and mining of our ore body, we've also got long life. This is a multi-decade mine, as well as effectively the carrot that is dangled in front of our customers, which is partner with us in the first round, and you're going to get dibs on expanding uranium in the 2030s when, let's face it, you're really going to need that product as the deficit starts to open up, and you're already in the system with a cooperative relationship that makes it natural that you'd be able to double down on your supply from Etango. So there's some big advantages that are inherent in the way that we've decided to develop the Etango ore body. As for your question about news flow that we can expect to be delivering, well, what I would like to be in a position is to be providing that news flow over the course of this calendar year. We've set ourselves a target of achieving final investment decision in this calendar year. That's market related. We've been patient for a long time, as you mentioned, so we're not going to lose that patience anytime soon. But my expectation is that this market will develop in a very favourable way over the course of this calendar year, and we will be presented with the opportunities where we can start writing contracts on terms that are appropriately favourable for all of our stakeholders, including our shareholders and our local Namibian stakeholders.
So really seeing this as you guys sticking to your promise of delivering scale and then expanded scale, or this additional leverage that comes with being intelligent on the sector to be able to make the right financial moves when it comes to term contracting. The next steps here, and I want you to just touch on this briefly because you already covered it, and of course there's more information that Bannerman has put out on this as far as schedule goes, and folks can look that up. But I want Brandon, if you would, touch on a few of those highlights on the milestones on the schedule, just as far as if everything goes according to what we would expect in your current schedule. Market conditions are there. Some of this is underpinned with term contracts and helps the banks if that's the route we're going to go here and get all this stuff put into place. My view is that 2025 will most likely bring all that together for the most part in order to at least get the financing package substantially completed. But just obviously there'll be in parallel stuff as well. But talk a little bit about, post construction decision, assuming everything goes according to how we think this plays out. Talk about timing for financing, you think, the overall construction period, and then what you see as a rough date for commercial production. Of course, we know that it's in the neighborhood of 2027, potentially 2028, but just firm up those couple of milestones for us.
Why this raising has been so important, and why coming back to the bulk earthworks contract and the other construction infrastructure, why pushing the button on those is so important, is that basically locks in an option for us to be producing uranium in 2027. The reason I say it's an option is whether we push forward with production according to that timetable or whether we take our time a little bit more is going to be driven by market fundamentals. And that's the type of flexibility we've worked so hard and been so deliberate in our decision making to ensure that we've got, as per our previous conversation. So if everything goes according to plan and according to my fairly optimistic expectations of this sector over the next 6 months, then we'd be achieving a final investment decision by the end of this year. And that means that in addition to the construction items that we've already committed to, we can then roll into all of the additional construction requirements. So place orders for the crushers, the other large piece aspects of our mechanical orders, continue into concrete work, so move from bulk earthworks into concrete, start construction of the permanent water pipeline, permanent power line, start hiring our workforce, and all of those steps that are necessary. And that's Gavin's domain. The other reason why I call it an option is you need to maintain a very realistic view of execution risks when you're moving into construction. So for us, most fundamentally, was what I mentioned before, we knew that it would be foolish to have the company continue to be run by someone who doesn't have a successful track record in building projects bigger than what we want to do. So hence why I stepped into executive chair and Gavin Chamberlain stepped into CEO role. Now, Gavin talks incessantly and accurately about execution risk. Because he obsesses about execution risk, it gives myself and the board just so much comfort that he's onto it. He's mitigating it at every turn. I could talk at length about some of the examples that I'm capable of understanding of where he's taken active steps to reduce the execution risk. And I love that because it's enhancing our fundamental advantage with our project, which is that simplicity and that reliability that I talked about. So subject to always needing to be vigilant on execution risks, we've got a high degree of confidence that we will be able to construct this mine and deliver production according to our construction timeframe without major risks of delays, overruns, etc. But that all comes back to when do we push the button, and that comes back to final investment decision, which in turn relates to the financing and the long-term contracting and the interplay between how many contracts do we need to write for a given financing structure. So if it all goes according to plan, as you say, that would have us producing our first uranium in 2027 and moving into full production at 3.5 million pounds in 2028. It's a relatively fast commissioning, it's a relatively fast ramp up, and the execution risk associated with that ramp up is low by industry standards. The reason it's low is it's so conventional, it's so simple, and we've done several years of piloting at our heap leach demonstration plant. So there's no science project, there's no experimenting, there's no crossing fingers when it comes to the ramp up, because we've simulated all of that in an industrial scale through our demonstration plant, which we constructed in 2014 and have run for several years.
I think that's, again, another one to point out is it's a very simple project, which inherently comes with reduced risk. And we're obviously seeing risk play out unchecked in some of these other areas of the market and some of these other companies that are out there attempting to put cake in a can, and lots of different types of problems that we're seeing, and more to come for sure, whether it's political issues, jurisdictional issues, mineralogy issues, hydrology, all the things that you have out there that competence as well is a challenge in the sector. So there's just lots of parts and pieces here that the struggles are being seen, and even some of the best out there are not delivering as they promised, which for us and our greenfield constructors such as Bannerman, that continues to add to the pressures on this market, because the reliable suppliers, or the ones that were once thought reliable, are also having their challenges as well. Some of the kinks will get worked out, some of this will get resolved, but I think we'll continue to see challenges for many years ahead here yet to come, Brandon. With that, I want to talk briefly about jurisdiction. As you know, Brandon, you know firsthand, because of the amount of time you spent in Namibia living there with your family, that so far this has been a standout jurisdiction to operate in amongst African jurisdictions. And I'm not just talking uranium, I'm talking a number of other things that Namibia offers in mining in the country. In many respects, it really rivals other jurisdictions like the US, Canada, and Australia in some respects, as you and I can think of some of those respects. But how do you see government policy shaping up to support foreign investment across the board as the world diverges in different areas? For Namibia, not just favoring a specific party, for example, Brandon, like obviously China's involvement in Namibia, for example. Just talk about that, and if you see country risk as a notable issue, or it's something that has been proven over and over that Namibia is a good place to be.
Well, you've said it yourself, Andrew. Namibia's so far been a standout. It's been a standout in Africa, probably with Botswana as being at the absolute pinnacle of operating risk in the continent. And for many people, they understand that Africa is an enormously diverse place. And you've got the good, like Namibia and Botswana, you've got the bad, and you've got the ugly. And unfortunately, it's really only the ugly that makes its way to Hollywood, and that tends to inform the average person about their view on Africa, and they end up with a view that means that when they come to a country like Namibia, they're absolutely astonished about just how nice it is, and how easy it is to operate, and how safe it is, and how secure and how friendly the people are, etc. And so that's Namibia. That's what it's like. It's just a great place to be in and a great place to operate. Now, where it does stand up to even the best jurisdictions in the Western world, such as Western Australia, where I'm recording from and where I live now, is when you put the uranium overlay. Because Western Australia consistently is one of the very best mining jurisdictions in the world, if you're mining something other than uranium. And frankly, if you're trying to mine uranium in Western Australia, it sucks, because there's a ban against uranium. And even for the companies that got their permits before that ban was implemented, you've got an entire system of bureaucrats who are confusing their day job with being armchair activists, and they're making life difficult. And that's the case for Queensland in Australia, which is the host to some beautiful ore bodies as well. And you get different versions of political and social and environmental risk in other top class Western mining jurisdictions as well. And that's what really evens up the playing field, to the point where I continue to make the claim that Namibia is the best, all things considered, the best development jurisdiction for a uranium mine in the world. One of the aspects where it absolutely shines is that interest groups which have constructed an entire industry in the West of interfering in projects, sometimes for what they believe are good reasons, sometimes which are purely commercial reasons being driven by competing interests, they don't get traction in Namibia. They just don't. If there's a legitimate concern, there's an industry body called the Namibian Uranium Association, which has a collective reputation to uphold, which will resolve it. And occasionally, one of the mining companies doesn't exercise best practice in some department, and it's the industry who solves it, because otherwise we're all at risk. But this idea of interference from European NGOs and others who have just such sophisticated mechanisms in Australia and the US and Canada and elsewhere, they get run out of town because the locals are saying, hang on a sec, these are our jobs, this is our prosperity, this is our rates and taxes, this is our local infrastructure and our schools that you're interfering with. You let us decide what we want in our country, and you go back to Holland, or you go back to where you came from. So that's the real advantage of operating in Namibia. When it comes to uranium mining, there is absolutely no political debate. There's no doubt about it. It's a country that's been built off the back of diamonds and uranium, and that's not going to change. Going forward, what's really fascinating at a geopolitical level is Namibia has an interesting history. It was the last African state to achieve independence. It did that via a UN resolution, one of the relatively few examples of the UN being absolutely cooperative from all corners of geopolitics. And for that reason, it's continued to have a very open-facing stance on international diplomacy. It welcomes investment from China, it welcomes investment from Europe, from Australia, from the US. The three biggest embassies in Windhoek are the US embassy, which is enormous, the Chinese embassy, which is enormous, and the Russian embassy, which is substantial. And then the fourth largest is the South African embassy, given that there's still quite a significant umbilical cord in trade back to its southern neighbour, South Africa. So that means there's a really helpful, productive balance for the country of Namibia from both the global south, as it's called, and the west. What that means in practice, though, is evolving in our favour through the discovery of oil in Namibia. So Namibia is a tiny country, roughly 2.5 million people. It's still got widespread unemployment, desperately needs development. And for a long time, they were blessed not to have oil because the systems of government developed in a very independent way. There's very limited corruption. Transparency is good by developing country standards. So for a long time, they were blessed not to have oil. And now the country finds itself blessed to have oil. After 30 years of exploration, there's now quite literally an oil rush where several Western companies have now discovered what appear to be very substantial commercial oil fields off the coast of Namibia. So in Namibia's posturing, it now needs to go into a phase of appealing to Western capital at scale so that it can develop its oil fields. And as an interesting aside, Andrew, going back to some of our earlier questions, for a long period of time, there was a lot of pressure on Namibia, particularly from Germany, to just leave those oil discoveries fallow and not to develop it. And to Namibia's great credit, on behalf of its own citizens, it said, actually, thanks for your input, Germany and EU, but our citizens are going to need this oil and we're going to develop it on our own terms, so butt out. And that's what they did, and now the EU has accepted that. But I digress. The point is that the big ticket in town for Namibia now is no longer diamonds and uranium, it's now oil. And so its decisions that it makes in respect to the hard rock mining sector will be amplified in their effect on what Namibia now needs to do to attract capital on the right terms for its oil sector. And that flows both ways. We've had some ups and downs where a debate that's really around oil gets expanded to be inclusive of hard rock mining, and luckily the Ministry of Mines and Energy very quickly rectified any of the reporting or any of the incorrect assumptions that changes that were being proposed for the oil sector were going to impact the hard rock mining sector. But equally, it has that advantage that I just articulated, where Namibia is now on show to the Western world as to the way that it invites capital in to develop its oil sector and, frankly, to transform the company. It's 2.5 million people. We're talking about a multifold increase in the country's GDP as a result of successfully harnessing oil production over the next several years. So using words like game changer don't even start to explain how big an impact it can have if handled correctly on the country and its people.
That is very good to hear. The self-determination is great. To turn away some of these global bullies and say, take a hike, we're doing our own. I love it. And I agree. The oil bit, offshore, onshore potentially here as well. The gold, that's a little bit of gold mining in this area, some of the gold deposits that are being wrapped up in M&A as we speak, as well as the incumbent uranium and also diamonds. And just really great to see that, and great to see that type of, for a population that small, Brandon, like you said, it doesn't say much to say that it's a game changer. It's a complete needle mover from one end of the scale all the way to the other side. You can have tremendous development and success for the people there. And there's no better way to do it than through these industries, which are absolutely critical to have. Because, I mean, you're not going to do it through bird watching, or Namibia could maybe have some attractive tax policies and these things, but tourism, yeah, yes and no. You have to look at it from what's the best bang for the buck, and this certainly brings it to a place where you can, in the future, potentially look at those other industries as the country matures and it goes down its life cycle. So I really appreciate that. And you wrapped it into another question I was going to ask you, but maybe you can just speak briefly to this, because I think you handled the NGO stuff, as we know now that it's community work, it's government relations, and now you have to set aside another department to deal with NGO management. And I've seen that happen a lot, most recently in a lot of different jurisdictions, where companies now have to manage these NGOs who, most of them, make stuff up, and it's a complete battle full time. Comments as far as, a few things maybe Bannerman has done or is doing or plans to do as the company obviously gets bigger and can absorb these bigger commitments, just, on community front and relations, and keeping that always continuing effort to have a relationship, keep the alignment, and keep the social license and acceptance for the project and operations.
Yeah, it's a great topic to deal with, and I will be brief here, but it would be a critical mistake to come into a country like Namibia and take for granted your social license just because there aren't as many groups who are prepared to hold your feet to the fire. And the uranium sector in general has not taken that approach, and I've been a trustee of the Namibian Uranium Association, so I've really seen firsthand how jealously the uranium sector in Namibia guards its social license. And we've been very careful to always make the most of that. When it comes to NGOs, our strategy that we haven't needed to rely on, fortunately, but our strategy is to make sure that if there is any NGO interference, we will have a small army of local people who will gladly and passionately do the defending for us. And I think that would exist. I'm absolutely confident with the work that Werner Evolt's done that there would be many people who would come out in our defence if we ever needed it. Some of the examples of how we've established ourselves as the leader in CSR, ESG, community development in country is we've got a learner assistance program, which is an educational assistance program that I started when I was working for Bannerman back in 2010, 2011. It's continued every year since then. We've assisted more than 3,500 primary school students to stay at school. In other words, we've identified vulnerable children who probably after only a few years of school would otherwise have been dragged back into cattle herding or dragged into the poverty cycle. They would have left school innumerate, illiterate, and with almost zero options of breaking the poverty cycle. So we've worked with schools and the Ministry of Education to identify those vulnerable children, provided them support so that they've got the capacity and the pride to stay in the school system. and hopefully they stay long enough that they leave being able to have a basic education behind them and have a lot more opportunities in front of them. That's just one example, and it's just a brilliant program. But what it also does is it reminds people of the longevity of Bannerman, because that program's entering its 13th or 14th year. We're doing a bunch of other great stuff in country that I could spend another 2 hours talking very happily and passionately about. But perhaps the easiest way of summing up how well we're regarded is last year we won the African Mining Indaba ESG award for our community engagement. That's really the biggest international award that we would aspire to win, that can be won by a company in our situation, picked from all of the different mining of all different commodities throughout Africa by the single biggest resources investor conference that take place each year in Cape Town. So that was a big source of recognition for the team who pour their heart and soul into making sure that Bannerman is the best regarded leader in all things environment, social, community, and of course, the governance is a given in our sector, but we're careful with that too.
Brandon, thank you for that, and congratulations on achieving that award. And irrespective, even if you didn't get an award, I think you guys have done a fantastic job, and I think it's worthy of an award, whether it's an ESG award or just a good business practice award without ESG as the acronym. So I really appreciate your comments on that, how you guys have approached this and how you have really gotten involved with the local community there and how you guys have done it. At this point for Bannerman, I mean, it's well over a decade at this point for the company and establishing those relationships. So I appreciate the comments on that. Well, as we wrap up, and I appreciate the extended time here, Brandon, I just wanted to finish up with this final discussion topic before we wrap up. Any further comments from you here that you wanted to add through the conversation? Any shots at me, of course, but how do you see the company in the immediate years ahead with Etango in production? So let's move to that state and then look ahead, or maybe just a little bit before that, look ahead. The company's cash flowing. Etango is in depletion, but of course there is, as you said before, the ability to replace and expand. And of course, we see the pipeline locally right there in Namibia. But what else might be on the deck? And will M&A play a larger role? It has been, but will it play a larger role for Bannerman as it grows once it reaches this state?
Absolutely. We will be in such a privileged position. As you've articulated, Andrew, we're in production. We've got the capacity to double down and expand our production if we haven't already made that decision. So we're a large producer at 6.7 million pounds per annum, or soon to be at 6.7 million pounds per annum. There's not even talk of depleting the ore body in the sense that it's got another 100 million pounds beyond the first 16 years that can be developed, capacity to drill out satellite deposits to expand the ore body. So it's a multi-decade mine at scale with a team who, would have received due recognition, I think, for excellence by then. So what it does, and where it really enables us from a business development perspective, is apart from all of the inherently attractive aspects of that type of a production source and production center, it gives us patience. So because we've got a pipeline already, I'm not itching to satisfy investors who are saying, well, what are you going to do after you've developed Etango 8? Are you just going to be a one-trick pony? Well, no, we're not. We've got at least two tricks in the form of the expanded Etango. And it means that I can be a lot more selective about opportunities, because if I'm focused on developing a pipeline, I can afford the time required to either develop assets or support companies through partnerships or undertake other forms of corporate growth, so that ultimately production would be sitting in about that 2035 to 2030 timeframe. That's a key timeframe in terms of anticipated deficits in the sector. It's the discoveries that are being made now that will be absolutely vital in filling that deficit in the back end of that 2040s decade. There's a very interesting arbitrage that patience can play in terms of long-term value creation for our shareholders. Now, it might be that we decide to double down and have two nearer term production centres, and that's all fine. And any decision that we'd make like that would be on its merits. There aren't many advanced assets around the world that I'm attracted to, so that does make it a lot harder, and that also informs the approach that our board has taken on corporate growth, which is we want to go for quality, and therefore that might be that we have to play one of our key advantages, which is that inbuilt inherent patience that we've got because of this two-step development program that we've got. That's how I see it. As you know, Andrew, we've been really selective and very disciplined about corporate growth to date. We've looked at many, many things, and we've resisted growing for growth's sake. And, there's times when I wonder if the jury's still out on that approach, when I see companies who've merged up assets just simply to get bigger because they end up hogging a lot of the liquidity. So it is a pretty legitimate strategy to get big for big's sake in our sector, because as you get big, you get greater ETF flows, you've got more liquidity, generalist investors have got more capacity to invest into you. So 1 + 1 definitely equals 2.5 in this sector if you do it relatively well. But nonetheless, we've had a disciplined approach to growth where it's been quality foremost rather than quantity foremost. And so far that's served us well, and I think it'll be about building on that, the strength of our quality, whether it's people, assets, jurisdiction, strategy, longevity, and now this approach that we can take with the two-step production pipeline that we've got in the form of this enormous Etango ore body.
And I can respect what you guys have done, Brandon, because we've obviously seen the other end of the spectrum out here, where you've seen companies have to do something to backfill their valuation because their valuation is so far out of whack. And we've certainly seen that in recent transactions out there, where they must find something to bury that script to backfill their valuation. And pretty much anything will do, as we've seen. So I appreciate your guys' disciplined approach here, and I do think that the market is rewarding that and will continue to reward that as these milestones get hit. For potential investors, Brandon, who are listening in, the company today does have a market capitalization of about 560 million Australian dollars. Why should Bannerman Energy, in a concise statement, if you will, because we've already know really well why after this conversation, why should it be considered within the institutional, family office, and retail investors' portfolio at this stage?
Quite simply because we've got highly asymmetrical leveraged exposure to an improvement in both uranium fundamentals and uranium sentiment, particularly over the next 6 to 12 months. So that valuation looks okay for a pessimistic uranium scenario, but it looks very undercooked for an accurate, in my opinion, or an optimistic uranium price scenario. So for many investors, they want to get risk mitigated exposure to the uranium sector, either continuing as it is or improving, hopefully, in their minds. What Bannerman offers is a very streamlined exposure that's leveraged, that's got low risks, that's fully permitted, with a management team who knows what they're doing in this sector. So that tends to be the feedback that I get for investors who are institutions who are choosing to take a meeting in their busy schedule or choosing to invest in the company.
And Brandon, the best way for interested parties to contact and keep in touch with the company?
Best via email. So you can go to info@bmnenergy.com or bannermanenergy.com. Either of those come through. You can also reach out to us on X. We've got quite an active profile, or reach out to Bannerman Energy on LinkedIn as well. And Emma Culver is our communications coordinator. She's an absolute star. She's extremely responsive. So if you're a shareholder, you can also send her an email at shareholders with an S at bmnenergy.com.
Brandon, thank you very much for the long form updates. Always good to catch up. Really appreciate the conversation as usual, and we're looking forward to progress in the near term here. And of course, you're welcome back anytime. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Always enjoy our chats.